We are honored now to move to the first session of our program, a panel on the multidisciplinary perspectives on the importance of the rule of law. This session will be chaired by Maria Cattaui, a co-chair of the project and former Secretary General of the International Chamber of Commerce.
Thank you very much, and good morning to everyone, and welcome to this first plenary session. To look at this multidisciplinary perspectives on the importance of the rule of law to various sectors, and I would hesitate just to use the word sectors. I hope that we're beyond sectors here. We're also to various parts of humanity as well as various groups of people. To do this, we have a really very distinguished panel, as you can see, and we're going to proceed in the form of a conversation among us, first individually with each of the panelists, perhaps, I hope, between them and with you. So I do look forward to being able to open the floor to your questions. Let me just introduce the people who are here. You have your booklets, you have their bios, so very briefly and in purely alphabetical order, as I wouldn't even attempt to think of doing this by protocol. In alphabetical order, the Honorable Justice Anthony Kennedy, who's Associate Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. I believe, sir, you took your seat in February of 1988. His background in education is from Stanford, London School of Economics, so something on this side of the pond, and Harvard. His Grace, Thabo Makgoba, who is the Archbishop of Cape Town. And I also understand that you have been serving as Archbishop of Cape Town since January 2008, and it is noted in his bio that he is the youngest person elected to this office. In February of last year, that is of 2012, he was also inaugurated as Chancellor of the University of the Western Cape. Dr. Sakena Yacoobi. Dr. Yacoobi is the founder and executive director of the Afghan Institute of Learning, known as AIL. She is also the founder of the Professor Sakena Yacoobi Private Hospital in Herat and the Professor Yacoobi Private High Schools in Kabul and Herat in Afghanistan. AIL supported 80 underground home schools for 3,000 girls in Afghanistan after the Taliban closed the girls' schools, and I'm sure we'll hear more about that. Peter Rees, QC, is the legal director and a member of the executive committee of Royal Dutch Shell. And as such, he has ultimate responsibility for Shell's global legal function. He advises them on all legal matters of the group, wide of all importance. He has, I believe, something like 1,000 staff, of which 750 of lawyers. Can you imagine? Or intellectual property professionals, even worse, if I could say, more discouraging. However, the Shell legal function also includes the Ethics and Compliance Office, which will surely interest you, Your Grace. And Santiago Siri. Santi leads the R&D lab of online media company. Is it called Grupo 42? Is that right? And this is an ad tech leader in Brazil and Argentina. He is also, which is interesting, I think, to all of us, a peer at the Partido de la Red, a new endeavor, which is to widen the broadband of democracies through the use of social media technologies. Welcome to everyone. We have agreed that we would begin with just a brief bringing us up to date, Justice Kennedy, on some of your discussions yesterday, if you could, and then I will ask you a question about our session itself.
Good morning. Yesterday, judges from around the globe that are part of this conference here met to discuss the rule of law from the judge's standpoint. Let's be perfectly clear. The law doesn't belong to a bunch of judges and lawyers. It's yours, it's the people's, it's ours. And one other thing, be perfectly clear. The verdict on freedom and the verdict on the rule of law which sustains it is still out in half the world. In half the world, the jury has not returned. And they are watching those countries, those organizations, those thinkers, those institutions that believe in the rule of law, that believe in freedom. And they are waiting. They are waiting to see how we perform. And they are waiting to see sometimes whether or not the progress we make in this area can be disrupted vertically by nationalism, horizontally by class, race, and religious intolerance. And so, although Mr. Newcomb started by quoting quite properly Hammurabi or Aristotle, we think, well, we have a lot of time, the rule of law, we've been going on for this for a couple thousand years. My friends, we think time is running out. In an era of time and motion compression, we live in urgent times. The law must live in the consciousness of the people, and that requires teaching. And teaching is a conscious act. You don't take a DNA test to see if you believe in the rule of law. You don't take a DNA test to see if you believe in freedom. It's taught. And some of the things we discussed yesterday are how judges, in the performance of their particular function, can and must, by their fidelity to their oath, by their pride in their profession, teach by example. But the teaching must be much further. And I think the purpose, Madam Chairman, of this conference is to ask how all of us can better understand the rule of law and then better teach it in our countries and in our communities throughout the world.
Tell me something, Justice Kennedy. Let's start right at the base of things. What do we actually need in order even to have a rule of law, even before we define it or see how we maintain it? What are the ingredients? What do we need at the beginning point?
Well, that's a simple question, isn't it? I suppose number one, you need a population, a people that understands the importance of human dignity, the meaning of human dignity, the necessity to respect each man and each woman. And they must see that the law gives us a system, gives us a guarantee, gives us the capacity to do that.
And do the various parties to this, do they all have the same objective? Do they have to share the same objective?
Well, the whole idea of freedom is that you can shape your own destiny rather than have the government do it for you. So each person can define for himself or herself those attributes of a good life, of a fulfilling life, of personal self-esteem. And we can discuss, it's very difficult to imagine that you have the capacity to plan your destiny without some rights of property, because government always wants to plan your destiny for you.
Let me ask you, you hinted at this in the introduction brief introduction of bringing us up to date from yesterday. What should we look out for when things go wrong? What do you mean by we should be alert now? What is it that concerns you?
Well, I suppose that each people, usually organized within a national state, should have a set of aspirations, a set of objectives, a set of common beliefs that have an ethical substructure. And if something goes wrong, you have to ask whether or not you've defined the ethical precepts that govern your society in a way that's sufficient to reach out to human aspirations and to human striving.
Are you more concerned today about the way the world is looking at the rule of law than you were or earlier in your career, or you think we're progressing from the charts that we've seen or not?
Well, I don't want to be an old duffer who's pessimistic, but look at in the 1840s, there was a new word, rationality. We're going to be governed by reason. That lasted for about 2 years in 1848. And the forces of racism, of class, of embedded self-interest, of racial intolerance, soon upended that idea. World War I came, which I think is the most evil and senseless act of the millennium. And the World War I was between the most, quote, civilized countries in the world for no reason at all. After World War I, we had the so-called Dada movement in art. And Dada means the same in Europe as it does in the United States. It means dumb, duh. That's the Dada movement. There was a distrust of any values that are defined by the human mind, and that can't be. That can't be.
So what is it today that worries you?
I need His grace. I need His grace's help. You're getting me too quickly into His field.
Well, we'll move over then to His grace and come back to you, because you did say at the start that you are concerned that we've perhaps arrived in the world at a moment when we have to think very carefully about how the rule of law actually is implemented, is used, is maintained.
And even in my own country, we can talk about this later, I think people simply take freedom for granted. But freedom has to be transmitted from one generation to the next. The idea of democracy, and it's right in Aristotle, is that each generation is the trustees of freedom for the next. And their duty is to make freedom stronger, not weaker, and trustees don't grab all the assets for themselves, and trustees don't misuse the assets that they have, and I don't mean just money, but I mean our intellectual heritage. We cannot ignore it. We cannot, by ignorance of the past, allow the great strivings and the great failures and the great achievements of the past to be forgotten.
And is that why, to a certain extent, you were saying before, that you can't leave the rule of law to the professionals, to the politicians, to the judges, that it needs to be embedded and maintained by people? And do we have enough knowledge of how we can make sure that that happens, except through education?
Well, obviously education is crucial, but look at power and wisdom don't come from the government to the people. It's just the opposite.
Well, then I'm going to turn to you, Your Grace.
Thank you.
When we're looking at this, you have said as a starting point that you need a fundamental perspective, one of principle when it comes to the rule of law. Perhaps you could tell us a little more what you mean by that.
Thank you very much.
Maria is
good enough. Maria is good enough. Thank you. Thank you, Maria. And perhaps before I answer that question, I also need to thank the organizers of the World Justice Project. I feel privileged to have been invited to participate here as a man of the cloth or a churchman. I think the ultimate principle, speaking as a churchman, is, does law recognizes that it has to be a good servant rather than a bad master? And by a good servant, I mean, does the rule of law recognizes that it has to be of service to the good of human beings? does it help human beings and communities and individuals to flourish? Or is it about those that have power and those that have money?
What would be your message then to those who are in charge of implementing the rule of law?
My message would be maintain this broader perspective of serving the common good. Deliver true justice,
Yes.
genuine justice, not according to those that have power and access.
It's sometimes difficult when you are in the profession of, let's say, maintaining the rule of law, to base it on, not simply, but to base it so deeply on a concept of the good for people. It's much easier if one can refer to things like constitutions, things such as legislatures, things that are there more concrete. You're asking a very difficult thing for those who are in charge of...
I think, yes, I said earlier on, I'm speaking as a man of the cloth, and I'm speaking as one that wants to liberate the rule of law from really being self-serving and concentrating on the few as opposed to serving the whole of humanity. But I mean, if I go back to the South African Constitution, and I'm conscious that I've got a number of South African lawyers here that may interpret it differently from a cleric, but there are values there of freedom, values of justice, values of equality, and I'm sure those are not values for some and not for all. And I'm saying the rule of law should actually be for all, and that constitution, the framework is not for some in a South African context, but it is for all. So that is the challenge, and that should remain the vision. And how you knock it in terms of your everyday practice as the legal fraternity, I can leave it up to you. All I'm saying is it cannot be reduced to what does it cost and does the law allow it? And then you bend the rule enough to address what it costs and whether the law addresses it. I'm saying we should not be afraid to say, why is winning cases decoupled from doing justice? As a lay person, that should worry me, and I'm sure my learned friends here should also be worried and ensure that their praxis serves human dignity and human flourishing.
Your Grace, do you in this vision base this, of course, on your religious beliefs, but do you see a concept, or do you think there should be a concept of universal use of human rights as a basis around the world, or not?
No, I agree. I mean, the Human Rights Declaration 60 years ago highlights what most religions would agree with, and what those of no religion agreed on about 60 years ago. It talks about access to health, assisting those that do not have employment, and assisting those that do not have access to housing. I'm paraphrasing the declaration there, and my argument is that task should not be left only to the NGOs that are concerned about human rights, nor to religious context, but those declarations are very fundamental, and every sector should embody those human rights. When you do, I'm being provocative, when you do fracking in South Africa, you should look at business sense, but you should look at the importance of the communities around where you're doing your business. You should look at whether you're going to help the community, you're going to help development, and you're going to leave the integrity of creation respected. And I think that's what I'm talking about.
To come perhaps a little bit more to the context in which you were living,
yes,
in South Africa and in Africa, do you see some major challenges now for what was before generally described as the principles on which the rule of law is based? Do you see any really difficult challenges that beyond those that you have mentioned now that you're confronted with?
I think in a developing democracy like South Africa, there's bound to be growing pains, and as we mature as a country, the Constitution is a wonderful framework where people of religion and all South Africans could look at the principles and apply them. There have been recent challenges, for example, on what we had termed the secrecy law in South Africa, but it gave us an opportunity as the faith communities and the non-governmental organizations, and I'm glad some of them are here, Lawson Naidu from the CASAC and Mark Haywood from Section 27, who are vigilant together with the churches in ensuring that freedom of speech is not curtailed. And we suspected that the secrecy bill that was being introduced had the potential to curtail freedom of speech. So that is one such example that I can remember off the top of my head.
So that's something that you would lend your spiritual strength to combat?
I would lend my spiritual praxis and my spiritual strength as a South African, as a human being, knowing that I value the dignity of each person as created from my perspective in the divine and as a reflection of the divine. I will lend my spiritual strength because I think we need to celebrate the dignity of difference as South Africans, that we cannot allow the imbalance between the judiciary, the executive, and to allow the executive to dictate what South Africans ought to be. We need to engage and shape South Africa together.
If I may, for just
yes,
one
please,
minute,
Justice.
and we have other panelists, something His Grace said reminded me. One of my favorite authors some years ago was Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He subsequently said and did some rather strange things. But he wrote a book called One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and it's 24 hours in the life of a prisoner in a Siberian prison camp. And it's a magnificent story of human spirituality and human striving. So he was my great literary hero at the time. I recommended the book, taught the book in one of my courses. He was then asked to give a speech, the Charter Day speech at Harvard. And if Harvard asks you to give the Charter Day speech, they think that's as important as the Nobel Prize. I mean, this is a big thing. And this was days pre-fax machine, and so I had to wait for 2 or 3 days to get the New York Times to get the text of his speech. And I was just so disappointed and shocked that my literary hero said something to the following effect. He attacked the West. He attacked the West for their obsession with the law. And he said any people that define humanity, that define the tissues of existence in legalistic terms are doomed to spiritual mediocrity. I said, what does this mean? And it then occurred to me that he thinks of law differently than we do. From his background, law was a diktat, a ukaz, a mandate, a decree, a command. For us, it's a promise. It's a liberating force. It's an assurance that what His grace was saying, that each of us has a core of human dignity, will be respected. And that's a difference in approach. And we must make that very clear, that the whole purpose of the law is to define and to defend the idea of an inviolable human personality.
Yes, I mean, if I may add there,
please.
I was just, the point I'm underscoring is we should differentiate rule by law and the rule of law.
Yes.
Because there's a subtle difference there, because if we rule by law, we have limited nation states, we've limited people, we become very legalistic, and we miss the opportunity to let communities and individuals flourish and even challenge laws that are wonderful but seem to favor particular sectors of the communities because they have access to those laws.
You know, in many parts of the world, while these very high principles are well even enunciated, sometimes even in constitutions, somehow or rather there is no respect for the law because it has failed in its implementation, or it's non-existent almost in anything but words. And some people here, particularly yourself, Dr. Yacoobi, have experienced a total vacuum. There may be some abstract constitution written somewhere, some body of code of law which has absolutely, totally divorced from the reality of the situation. And I'd like to come back very much and ask Justice Kennedy afterwards, talking to you, how do we get over this lack of respect for the rule of law, even if somehow rather it exists in an entity, but doesn't seem to go anywhere or have any meaning for the people? Can you perhaps tell us a little bit about the circumstances under which you actually began the Afghan Institute of Learning, and perhaps the system, or if any, of any rules, of any laws, of any principles that you had to use in order even to start?
Thank you, Maria. First of all, I would like to thank the World Justice Project for inviting us, to have given us opportunity to really talk about this issue, which is a very important issue, and we all are involved today, and we are looking forward to see what we accomplish. I founded Afghan Institute of Learning in 1995, and when I was in a refugee camp in Pakistan. And during that time, you know, as all of you know, that in 1979, Russia invaded Afghanistan, and we were in civil war inside Afghanistan, and about 7.5 million refugees were in Pakistan, and people were really devastated. There was no job, no home, no opportunity, and people were really devastated. And there were not any other foundation that people could really live on. And the norm of life was war. Everybody was thinking about war, nothing else. At that time, that I founded the Afghan Institute of Learning. My main objective was to really educate the people and teach them about their health and about how to survive in a foundation and bring a system that they could live up to it. And to do that, it was really ourselves. We have to really, at the time in Pakistan, there wasn't any law or rule of law for us in a refugee camp, and there wasn't a government, but there was some rule of law like in UNHCR or in the refugee camp for Pakistan, but not really for us in Afghanistan because we didn't have a government. So we really decided that we want that the people be able to have education, which is a human right. People have to be able to live peacefully, which is a freedom of life. We wanted people to have ethics because that is fair and justice, and to respect others, and to really be listened to and work together. And that way, we set up our own rule of law, sort of. And because we decided that if we set up this rule, and people will live by it and learn by it, and then we will be fine, we will be okay. And that was what we did. We created this law, and when people ask a program, we set up that a condition that here is our policy and this is our procedure. And if they could live by that, then we work with them and we provide a service for them. And that was to really, they work with us, and according to their needs, by the communicating with them, by listening to them, by getting them involved, we provide service for them. And that was really bring both sides together. We built a relationship that they respected us and we respected them. And this relationship also is encouraged the people to come and request more work from us, a lot of service from us. And that was the time that even the people inside Afghanistan, when there was no school and people were not allowed to go to get education, they come and requested education from us. And that was the time that during the Taliban, we went into Afghanistan and we set up a school and health education.
You have now sort of gone beyond the rule of law, because actually what you were doing was against a particular rule of law, a particular system, and you dissented from it, which comes much closer to what Archbishop Thabo was saying, which is that you based it on another set of principles rather than the existing law. This is a different way of getting at a universal set of principles, but it isn't exactly the rule of law. Justice Kennedy, how would you regard this kind of action on the ground? It is another kind of set of principles, but it isn't quite the rule of law, or is it?
Oh, I think it is. The rule of law ultimately depends on human dignity, and we strive to define that and to achieve it in different ways and in different circumstances. Look, I carry around the Constitution of the United States. In Washington, D.C., it gets very cold in the wintertime. If there's somebody lying in a steam grate, time to get warm, do you think I say, you know, you have a right to jury trial, and you can own your own newspaper? No, he's cold, he's hungry, he wants something to eat. Yeah. But please don't make the mistake to say that the law is indifferent to that. Now this gets a little legalistic, but you can't have a constitution today unless there's a right to education, as you've just mentioned, the right to shelter, right to medical care. We can't put these in constitutions and have judges enforce them, or judges are running the country. If you have a complete set of rights and obligations that the judges enforce, you've got a judicial oligarchy. There has to be a consensus among the people that they have certain values and certain aspirations.
And
Did you write down your principles? Because you were saying, where are they? I want to read those.
Well, absolutely. I will give it to you. As a matter of fact,
I want to see that.
Really, I do. As a matter of fact, we had a set of rule that we said, okay, that's our objective, that we want that they will be educated, they will be healthy, they will be empowered, they will be able to protect themselves, they have security, they have peace. And these are all in universal principle of rule of law.
Were you confident that you had sufficient vocabulary to cover all of human needs?
Well, you know, one thing that is very important that
this is a draftsman, agree.
And I want to mention this, that when you live in a society that they are 70% are not educated and they don't understand the law as such,
yes.
You have to communicate in their own language, and you have to communicate in their tradition, and you have to communicate in their culture, and you have to communicate in a way that they accept your rule of law, not a sort of quotation as a theory rule of law.
But Dr. Yacoobi, your principles were not necessarily the principles that were pertaining at that time in Afghanistan. For instance, the right to education for your girls was not permitted.
The point is, Mary, that I went with the objective to really educate the people of Afghanistan, especially the women and girls. And my objective was to really apply this role to really get the people to be able to sort of interest in education, because at the time, if you remember, that even that we have a civil war inside Afghanistan, and there were a group of people, they were rejected education for girls. And during the Taliban specifically, they were denying education for women and girls. So because of that, so we have to come around it and to see how we apply it. As a matter of fact, we built such a strong relationship with the community. Also, we apply community participation that give people responsibility and accountability, and that also the people respect you. And when they respect you and they really appreciate what is given to them, so they are not really giving free things, we are asking them to participate in all action that we are doing with them, all service that we provide for them. Because of that, EOL was very successful, and that is still we are doing that. Today I'm in Afghanistan. We are reaching 10 million people. Just in the month of January, we reached 10 million people providing service. And all this is continuously Afghan Institute of Learning being successful because of this role in policy and procedure. Even in Afghanistan today, we say we have a law, we have a constitution, yes. We have this or that. But if we go into that, you know what's the solution. But we are just doing the role, the universal principle rule of law.
Well, you've been challenged now by Justice Kennedy. You're going to have to give us and send to us the principles on which you have based this work, and perhaps also let us know, if you have it, how you tied that into, as you say, the universal principles that you were upholding. I'd like to just bring in perhaps two other what is called sectors, but really two other parts, enormous parts of our lives today. The first is the business world. And coming myself from the business world, I have great sympathy for the multitude difficulties that businesses have, not today just with the rule of law, but unfortunately also with the misuses of law, if I could put it this way. So I turn to you and ask you, first of all, very generally, Peter, how do you start at Shell to look at the rule of law? What does it mean? How is it applied concretely in Shell?
Well, I think the distinction that was made earlier is hugely important, that you need to talk about rule of law, not rule by law. Mm-hmm. And you also, I think, need to look at some of the things that Bill Newcomb was saying earlier in terms of what constitutes good rule of law. But where you have good rule of law, then I think it has to be clear that it sort of means what it says, law rules. So a good rule of law has to overcome political interest and financial interest and personal interest. And if it's alive and well, then it should be the law that is defining the rights and obligations of the people. But that does require the rule of law to be good, and one of the contents of a good rule of law is the ability to review the law and to challenge it and to reshape it if it is not meeting societal needs. But fundamentally, the law is what it is. When I was a young lawyer, one of the first trials I went to, the judge started his judgment by saying, this is not a court of morals, and this is not a court of justice. It is a court of law. And it struck me at the time, actually, that that was very interesting, because if you think about it, morals can be very subjective. And actually, justice can be very subjective. One man's justice is another man's injustice. The law is the objective thing that binds it together. And so I think from that perspective, you have to look at it as something which, without it, we have an anarchic state. You have the person who is the biggest or the largest or the most lethal weapon is the one that rules. So the rule of law is there to protect the weak and to control the strong. And that is certainly the way we look at it. And the other thing I would say is it should always be remembered that the rule of law cuts both ways. And if the law is what the law is, and it's a good rule of law, then sometimes it may find in favor of business, and sometimes it may not find in favor of business. But equally, if you are subject to the rule of law and applying the rule of law, then you have to accept that verdict. And I think Nelson Mandela is on record as saying exactly the same thing.
There's several things, and we don't, I'm sure in many of our smaller group meetings we'll get into such matters when it comes to business. I'm sure that many of your 750 lawyers in your staff, gigantic, bigger than most legal firms around the world, are very concerned with things like compliance, with the nitty-gritty of all the countries in which you are active, of making sure that you comply with every single bit of their law, or you're going to have lots of suits and governments also against you. But you're also active in countries where the rule of law has not come down to meters and meters of pages of financial compliance, workspace, environmental compliance, and where it's very iffy, if I could put it this way, where the circumstances are such that you almost have to make your own rule of law since there's none that you can actually comply. How does Shell manage in situations that are extremely shady, if I could put it that way?
Nice way of putting it.
Well, you're quite right. We have to focus very much on compliance. But where we are operating in areas where the rule of law, as you say, is shady, then we have to make sure that we apply the standards that we would apply if we were working somewhere else. We would prefer to work in countries which have good, solid rule of law. And unfortunately, the good Lord didn't put the oil and gas necessarily in all of those countries, and so we inevitably have to work in other places too. Having said that, half of our investment last year was in OECD countries, Australia, Canada, United States. We would prefer to work in any country where there is rule of law. If there isn't, we look to apply, as I say, the standard. Shell was one of the first companies to introduce business principles in 1976. We have a code of conduct. Everybody within Shell is expected to live by that code of conduct, which not only includes all the basics that you would expect in terms of compliance, but it has 3 universal values which underpin everything that we do, and those are honesty, integrity, and respect for people. And that is something that is throughout the whole organization of Shell. What we try and do where there are issues is promote the rule of law. And we look to do it both globally, and we have been involved in things like the Voluntary Principles on Security and Human Rights, and we supported the work with the Institute of Human Rights and Business and so on. But we also look to build local rule of law and local capacity building, because that fundamentally is important. And it goes back to what Dr. Yacoobi was saying. You need to have local application of rule of law. You don't want all the time to be exporting from the local country the issues that are arising in that country. You want them resolved by the rule of law in that country. I mean, a couple of the things we have done in the recent past from a local perspective, which I thought I would mention given some of the panelists, we have supported the work over the years of Siri, which was the Central and Eastern European Law Initiative, which started off training judges in Eastern Europe as they came out of communist rule, but has now moved further. And Siri has been responsible for training judges in the Afghan Supreme Court and 140 judges in Iraq on judicial integrity and human rights. The other thing that I would mention in the context of free speech, which we've talked about, the Oxford University has a wonderful program on media policy and law, which promotes free speech and the ability to use all forms of media, including social media. They hold an annual moot competition for teams from all around the world, Africa, Asia Pacific, Indian subcontinent, and the Middle East. And that is always, again, brilliantly argued by the students in those countries who fundamentally believe in the right of free speech. So we look to support both globally and locally. We don't always get the credit for it, I have to say.
Peter, yes, you bring up a very good point, which I'd like to get back and ask everyone's opinion on after I have a word with Santi. This is perhaps more important for businesses than it is in a national context, because so many businesses deal today, large businesses, across borders. And that is when an issue arises where your fundamental principles are contradicted by the actual law of the land in which you are active. This could be issues such as freedom of speech or freedom of association. It could be fundamental principles such as intolerance, religious intolerance. It could be sexual intolerance. It could be problems that deal actually with the security or the inviolability of contract, all sorts of things. And I'd like to ask you all just a minute to reflect on to what extent does your extraterritorial application, even if it is of the most highest principles that you feel are the justice of the world, how do you manage that as a business? And should you be managing it? Should you be applying those principles? And this is not just when you're dealing with parts of the world that are at any given moment fragile in this respect. But it is also true, and we see it more and more now as the problems between security and privacy become ever more apparent. It is also true when dealing across borders, perhaps even in the most sophisticated of economies and the most sophisticated of political systems. So I would very much like to ask you from whether it's in a place where there is practically no law at all or no implementation to the extreme, how do you export, so to say? Are you actually applying extraterritorially businesses some principles that you are taking from your home country? And in fact, there's even a movement today, certainly when it comes to business and human rights, that companies should be held accountable, let's say international companies, to abide at least by the highest standards of their home country and apply that. Before we get on to that, let me just ask Santiago, Siri, I think you're known as Santi, is that right? Yeah. That's how you sign, please, your emails. You're come from the actually, being on this stage, you reduce our average age considerably here, which is very nice. And you come from the world of new forms of both social and political activism. And you're not alone in this. Many young people across the world, we see them in these new forms of political and social activism. So tell us a little bit how this applies to the ideas that we have been expressing now. Is this a new form of law?
That's a great question, and good morning, everyone. I'm 29 years old, so I'm very privileged to be part of this Congress and of this panel. And we're in the context right now where during the last 5 years, we have seen an amazing expression in the streets throughout the whole world. Since the Arab Spring, and even before that, in the Iranian elections, in the Ukraine, and in the last couple of years, throughout Europe, in Spain, in Greece, and in Latin America, we have seen it in Brazil, recently in Argentina, in my very own country. We have seen how a whole new generation is starting to get out in the streets. And even though in each specific country there are some local and more forms of protest related to the local conditions of each country, in particular country, there's also an underlying common denominator across all of these manifestations throughout the whole world. These manifestations are being organized through the use of social media and new technologies such as the internet. These manifestations are especially common in the younger generations, in a whole new generation. Since probably the 1960s, we haven't seen the young generations take the streets in such a global and massive way. And there's a sensation, there is clearly a steam that is not being contained by the valve. There's a big crisis of representation in the world right now. And I think this has to do basically because of the clash of the technologies that are where most of our systems are based on. Our legal and political and economical systems are still based on printing press, old school technologies from 5 centuries ago. And in the last 2 decades, we have seen the web be born and completely reshape and reconfigure our entire culture. And the internet is a very serious thing when we are discussing about the future of the world rather than the past of the world. There's a striking thing that really caught my attention when I started doing research around these topics, is that in every single parliamentary building, in every single place around the world, there's a huge printing press. I went in Argentina, I went to the Congress, to the National Congress, and I saw that huge printing press. It employs over 2,000 people, and every single process has to go through that printing ink and paper machine, either from asking from an official car or presenting a whole new project for the law. It's a lot of trees that it's required to legislate and codify under those systems. And the word system, for my generation, has more to do with ones and zeros rather than ink and paper. And there's a very important thing, that clash of systems that we're feeling. And the reason why a lot of people, even in democratic countries such as Spain, Greece, Argentina, Brazil, the countries that have a healthy democracy, there's still the sensation that it's not enough. The fact that we vote once every 2 years, it's becoming more and more ridiculous as we are used to interacting with other kinds of systems that have completely changed the way we work, the way we relate with others, the way we do commerce, the way we share and consume culture. Everything has changed except political and legal systems. So that's a very disruptive moment, especially under the view of the younger generations. This made me wonder all of this can suddenly start changing, how we can incorporate new technologies, embrace them in order to rethink the nation state, rethink the legal systems, and rethink how we can codify law. My father is a lawyer, and I'm a hacker, and I always wonder why in most parliaments 80% of the politicians that get elected are usually lawyers. I always wondered that since I was a very little kid. And then I got it. It's basically lawyers are the hackers of the old system. They are the hackers of the printing press age. They are the ones that manipulate the code written in ink and paper. And now we're moving towards a completely new paradigm. And that for me is very interesting. As a programmer myself, when I look at a piece of contract and I look at a piece of code, the similarities are striking. In both you will find, in a contract you will find terms and then clauses that operate around those terms. And in software you will find variables and then functions that compute on those variables. Structurally speaking, they're very similar. The main difference is that one is based on human language and subject to human interpretation, and the other one is based on completely logical language, not alphabetical, but rather logical language, symbolic logic, and is subject to machine interpretation. And as we are evolving, there are a whole new set of technologies coming out of the web that are really rethinking the way we use money, rethinking the way law applies, and reshaping the consciousness of new generations that do not feel they are part of a country in particular, they feel they are part of the whole new world entirely.
Well, Santi, that's absolutely fascinating. I'm sure that Justice Kennedy has questions for you. How do you like being called the hacker of the printing press age? And
Actually, Siri, you have more, your generation has more in common with other people around the world than any generation in history. The young people around the world, because of this innovation, of this remarkable technology, which is probably one of the great inventions in human history. There's the compass, gunpowder, the printing press. This is with them. And so you have the capacity and I think the willingness to communicate with young people around the world that is simply unparalleled in human history. And that's fascinating for those of us who wish to teach the rule of law. I have a friend who tells the story. He goes into the high school. His high school son is doing his homework, and he's got Skype on. He's talking to his friends. And he said, well, now you turn that off and you do your homework, and then you turn it on later after you finish your homework. He said, oh, Dad, you don't understand. When you were growing up, all they had was email.
Oh, yes. You have a new party that you're starting. By the way, in 1 minute, I'm going to ask to open up for questions. So please start thinking, don't be shy. Are there microphones around to pass around? Is that correct? Yes? So if the ladies and gentlemen who have microphones, if they could be prepared to pass them. Thank you. So tell us a little bit about how you apply this to a political party that you're even involved with.
Well, the problem we have right now is that there's clearly steam getting out of the valve. There's a lot of agitation in Argentina, in Brazil. The amount of countries, we're seeing it in the news every day, in every single place around the world. And the big question for me is how we go from agitation to construction, to building something new based on this entire new logic that is basically the net. So in Argentina, a little more than a year ago, along with some internet entrepreneurs, people that come from political sciences, educators, and a broad range of specialists from many different areas, mostly around our 30s, a group of people that are really interested in this new phenomena. We came out with the notion that we have to build a new kind of political party. We have to actually play with the rules of the given system and make an upgrade. Basically inject in the old system the new variables and the new structures of the net. So we created the net party. And basically the net party we're aiming, it's a local party for the city of Buenos Aires, but we also have some chapters throughout Latin America, in Chile, in Ecuador, in Paraguay, in Mexico, and some other places around the world. But we're aiming to do in Buenos Aires is what we want to run for elections. We're actually running for elections in October, and we want to put candidates for the local Congress of the city of Buenos Aires that will be committed to always vote according to an online system where the whole citizenship can put an input on. And basically, these Trojan legislators will be committed to always respond to this new online platform where what we want to build is rethink or try to think how democracy 2.0 will play out. With the use of new technologies, being able to widen participation through the use of mobile devices and internet connection. In Argentina, in Buenos Aires, internet connection is very common, it's very broad, and by starting up this process, we want to be compliant with the current rules and with the current law, but start building on top of that a new layer of online representation based on new technologies that can really use the power of collective intelligence to make much more, to lower the barriers of political participation and actually make the society more committed and involved with the decisions and opinions they have about the system.
Anyone have any comments on this stage about that?
I think my my one comment will be, with all these systems and codes and laws which are very important, I want to go back to my earlier comment that there's a human being out there, and the human being and his well-being should not be lost. To old hackers and new hackers, but that the integrity of the human person must be respected. If that system enhances how the greater good is served, how parity is respected, including where the technology is still a far-reached dream, then I understand. But if that intelligence, this newfound knowledge, is again another way of subjugating others, then the human being and his well-being are being compromised and lost. And I will again raise my ethical and moral neck, even if they are subjective.
Dr. Yacoobi.
And also, my point is that in a society that let's say they have 70% of the population are not educated, and 30% are the one that really a young group of young men that or young women that they are, let's say that these are the hacker of this kind of technology, and the society doesn't have really involved in accountability and responsibility. What will happen, the code of ethics, and what will happen to the, that responsibility that the human society supposed to really take over, and what will happen just the 30% of a hacker. Yes, in a population that you have 80% of the population are educated, that's a different story. How you deal with that in a society that they are not educated and isn't going to get out of hand, it wouldn't be a chaos situation, that it would be unjust and not fair to the rest of the
because
population.
they can't participate.
These are all great questions that are not very core to the mission that we're trying to build with the Net Party. First of all, Buenos Aires, Argentina is not a very advanced country in terms of internet usage itself. It's a country that, where, in terms of national statistics, 50% of the country is online, 50% is not. In the city of Buenos Aires, where that's the city that we're running for elections, 70% of the homes do have access, but especially in the younger generations. 89% of the people under 30 years old access the internet 7 days a week. So basically, by looking at the future, even in the lower part of in the lower classes, in the working classes, online access is a very aspirational thing, and there's even there a lot of access to this kind of knowledge. But still it's the number one mission, the most important mission of a party like this, to work to completely eliminate the gap of access to the internet. Everyone should have access to the internet. When we're talking about alphabetization throughout the whole world, alphabetization in the 21st century is not to learn how to read or write, or how to sum or rest numbers. Alphabetization in the 21st century is how to program computers, how to use these devices that will be the driving force of innovation and ideas in the world that is coming, and not that the world that just left. And I think that's a very key thing for a political party of this kind, to work towards widening the consciousness about the importance of the usage of new technologies. Thank you over there.
And that's not from your generation either.
And I think what His Grace mentioned is very important. There's a thing about the printing press, and that the fact about the printing press that is very common is that it's, structurally speaking, is the printing press set the basic foundations of all the structures of power in the world right now. The cost to emit signal, to send a signal, is way higher than the cost of receiving the signal in the printing press age. What I mean by that? The cost of printing the newspaper is very expensive, and you have to have industrial economical powers in order to print a paper, but the cost of buying that newspaper is very cheap. Everyone buys it. So it's very few talking to a lot of people, from few to many. That's the basic structure of everything, of the consumerist culture. The cost of producing manufacturing goods in the industrial age is very few people have access to that. The cost of buying, of being a consumer, is accessible for mostly everyone. The cost of, in politics, we have very few politicians and a lot of citizens. So the ones that get to be producers is an access that is very limited and very expensive, and the cost of being a consumer is very easy and very cheap. So the internet completely changes that. The cost of emitting a signal and the cost of receiving a signal is completely the same. Everyone can be a producer and everyone can be a consumer. The cost is exactly the same. And that's a very big change in terms of paradigms. In the Net Party, we call ourselves peers because we're all peers. We really believe in that notion of horizontality. And we do not mean by horizontality an equalitarianism that lowers everyone to the lowest denominator. Actually, we believe in the power of actually widening our view through the exchange with others and the importance of treating others as peers. I think that anyone that has experienced the use of social media or social networks, you are always confronted, your opinions are always confronted all the time, and in that essence, I believe that it's technologically speaking, the internet is a way more stronger democratizing force than any other technology in human history.
Well, we're now going to open to some of your questions, and where are the microphones? Do we have some microphones down here? Excellent. right across, let's start right here in the front. I see several, and if you could possibly go also to the back, one of you. All right, so we'll start right here in the center. There's a gentleman there. Just pass the microphone around right here in the center. Thank you very much.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amal Anursani. I come from Afghanistan. First of all, I'd like to say it's an honor and privilege to be here in front of such distinguished guests. If you may allow me, I have written up a pretty long question.
No, I am very rude. I will allow you to have...
I'll try to do my best to cut it short.
30 seconds.
30 seconds?
30 seconds.
Oh my goodness. So, I think we all do agree that rule of law should rule everything else. I don't think there's anybody who disagrees with that.
Take some notes.
But
get several questions.
what are we doing to define what law is? What is law? What is suitable? What is acceptable? What is practical? The law of the land in my country was to stone a woman if she committed adultery. Stone her to death. Is it acceptable? It was frowned upon. That's why we're in a war. What are we doing, most of all, to define it? Number one, to put together something that is acceptable by all. My question? Again, morals can be subjective, Mr. Rees. Justice can be subjective. Mr. Kennedy, you said that people create laws. They create their laws. I say law is subjective. You said we don't do business where good law does not exist. I think that is subjective too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to take several questions, 5 or 6. So if you want to make a note of any of them, please do so. Could we have right here the gentleman at the end, and then I'll take someone further back. We'll take that gentleman over there, and someone right at the back afterwards. Thank you.
Well, first of all, my name is Steve Zach. I'm past president of the American Bar Association, and I want to thank you for a very interesting presentation, very thought-provoking presentation. Santiago, I am concerned about the concept of the internet being used to be the sole determining factor of what should be decided by a legislator. The law by itself says that it is there to protect the minority from the tyranny of the majority. It would seem to me that if the internet was used, for example, to determine whether segregation was favored or not favored in the United States, we might still have segregation. Where is the protection of the Constitution and the rule of law in your system?
Let's take, I said I'd come over here. Is there a microphone over there? On that side? Oh, right here, there. And then one in the back, please.
I had the same question, so I'm foregoing. I had
Well,
exactly the
same question, right. Then we'll take in the back, and then in the lady here in the front. At the back there, do you have a microphone back there? Thank you.
Thank you very much. My question to Ms. Rees is whether lawyers and judges themselves do not use subjective factors in determining rule of law issues to the detriment of citizens who are unable to afford the best legal advice. And to Dr. Yacoobi, you have lived under different systems. Which system do you think provided better rights for women in terms of education? And also another question.
No, two.
I have 4.
No, I'm being very rude, but we'll try and get as many people, please excuse me, to try and be courteous to everyone. Right in the back, if you could go around so we can get someone on that corner. In the meantime, we'll take this lady here. Yes, please. And could you go back there a little bit? Thank you.
Ma'am, I have a very short question. What?
Could you just introduce yourself, madam?
I'm Kiran Bedi from India.
Thank you.
Is there a primary school of rule of law, or do we straight away begin with college and university? Thank you.
That's what an excellent question. Is there a primary school for rule of law, or do we have to wait until we're in university? Yes, I said at the corner over there. Yes, please go ahead. We'll take two questions on that side.
Hi, everybody. I'm Khaldoun Bshara from Palestine. My first question for Mr. Santiago. How do you guarantee that the net party would not reproduce the traditional system, because the web itself also is a matter of hacking? And how do you connect with the reality, knowing that not all the population has access to web? Mr. Peter from the Shell, the way you talk about social justice in your work paints a very romantic and ideal image of a system we know very corrupt, very unjust, and so far caused disasters to the law in terms of briberies and other things, let alone the injustice to environment.
The next door person there, please, also on that side, yes.
Thank you. Joshua Rabongoya. I'm a political scientist from Roanoke College in Virginia. 2 questions. Number 1 is, I think we need to be very careful about the good hackers from the bad hackers, the moral hackers from the immoral or even amoral hackers. My other question, again related to the internet, is how do we build institutional frameworks that minimize the risks of anarchy in the context of rule of law?
Thank you very much, sir. Yes, we'll take one here, and then the lady over there in the front there. Thank you. Go ahead. We'll take 2 then in the front. Yes, please, sir.
My name is Surya Dungyal. I'm from Nepal. My question, although, you know, all the speakers, you know, the marvelous presentation, you know, I feel I like to ask questions to each of them, but I'm sure, you know, you wouldn't allow me. As Justice Kennedy mentioned, you know, each generation should be the trustee for the next generation or the future generation. We saw the conflicting views between the 2 generations in the same, you know, present generation itself. And the judgments delivered by the courts also are based on laws, as we see, you know, in Fletcher, with regard to equality and education, Fletcher School and Brown education and the Bakke case. So many cases, you know. We see that the present generation that as judges working as trustee and the future generation of judges changing the rule of law through interpretation. How do you balance, one, the conflicting in the views of the same gender, you know, in the same present context between 2 generations, and as trustee, the conflicting rule of law interpreted by judges, which is conflicting, you know, for future generation also. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'll take 2 more and then ask here, yes, and then we'll come back to all of you. Not to answer everything, you just answer the ones you would like to.
Hi, my name is Sarah Angel, and I'm a 17-year-old, and I'm a political science and international relations student at the University of Toronto in Canada. And my question is, how can the rule of law be strengthened in countries where there's an established judiciary, an established legal system, but one that is weak or unequally applicable? Can a solution be found that by empowering the judiciary, by protecting judicial review and other judicial powers? Or can a solution be found by supporting private actors and organizations that protect fundamental justice when the state cannot?
Thank you very much. All right, we will, I see a lot of hands, but we'll just take 2 more and then turn here. Yes, this lady, and we'll come over here in the front here. Thank you.
My name is Caroline Usipedu. I work with Niger Delta Women's Movement for Peace and Development in Nigeria. And I want to talk to Mr. Peter. You talked about the voluntary principles on security and human rights. And my question is, why is it difficult to implement it in the case of the Niger Delta? Then the UNEP released a report on the state of the environment since 2011. Up to today, there is no implementation of that report. Where is the compliance? What is happening to the rule of law
Thank you very much.
in the case of environmental degradation and the oil spillages in the Niger Delta?
Thank you very much. Indeed. Did I see one more? It's difficult. All right, these 2 gentlemen here. Yes, if you're very short, both of you, but very short questions, please, so we can have some time to address them, and we'll come back here then. Very short.
My question is to Justice Kennedy. First of all, I want to thank the World Justice Project for this outstanding work they do, and I'm glad that Justice Kennedy is in our Supreme Court too. Question is, if President Obama call you in the middle of the night and say, Mr. Justice, there is a huge movement globally, people who are dying to have their rights respected, human rights, democracy, freedom of expression. And there is an idea, this is an idea I have been struggling with. I'm talking like the president now. What would you suggest we should do to globalize the rule of law?
Thank you. Right next door, very short also.
My name is Hussein Shaban. I am from Iraq. My question about the transitional justice and national reconciliation, and what is the position of the World Justice Project? Thank you.
And one last one over here. Yes, sir.
Yes, my name is Siri Sanchez Serrano, and I work in the area of healthcare and pharmaceuticals development worldwide. And the question that I have is the following: how do we overcome the big challenge between the way of being of a people? I don't mean necessarily culture, but the way of being of a people and the implementation of the law. Because in many cultures, it seems that there is a fear to freedom, and in which corruption seems to be like their DNA. So how do we find a way to fight that and to actually implement the rule of law in those countries?
Thank you very much. Well, obviously we could have questions for another hour or so, which just shows that this extraordinary panel has provoked a lot of thought. And I hope that that thought and those ideas and your willingness to express them will continue throughout the forum. Obviously, we're not going to be able to answer every single question. So what I'm going to suggest, and we can take the next 20 minutes to do this, is the following. That each of you just address those issues that you would like to, either individually or collectively, anything you would like. And at the end, I'd ask each of you to leave us with some challenge or message that you would like the audience to carry through for the rest of the forum. Now, I start with you, Dr. Yacoobi. Is there any particular question here that you would like to address?
For me, I really believe that the rule of law as what we practically apply to our work in Pakistan, in Afghanistan. This rule of law, like for example, human rights or right to security, right to education, right to health, these are a law that in every nation it's applied and it must be applied. And yes, there are a system that they don't define this law as a law of human rights or as a rule of law. But what we find out that we go around it and we try to, with the decision of the community, with the community, we went around it and the community backed us up and we applied that rule of law. And so if the community stands behind the law and you really work with them, then you apply the law. Doesn't make difference. A system allows you or it doesn't allow you. That's because if we wait for the system that allow us, we all must sit behind and forget about our foundation in our life. And we just go behind forever. But what we do, we think that, okay, we have the community support, we get involved in the community wants this law, the community wants this rule, and we apply it and we go along with it. And yes, for me, it is very hard in my country to try to say, okay, this law is a law that is protect the people, but it's not. Right now, I could not answer for this. But I find my way to apply for it. And as a result, I try to educate the people to really stand for this law.
Thank you very much, Yacoobi. Just as a reminder, some of the, I can't repeat them all, but some of the key questions that came up, defining what the law is. People create them, so they're always subjective. worrying about the tyranny of the majority. The systems we've touched on this, lawyers and judges maintain a certain hold or a certain knowledge of it. The primary school for the rule of law, which is very much why I asked you to begin, which is very much what Dr. Yacoobi is actually doing, is establishing the primary school for the rule of law. Good and bad hackers and all sorts of worries about the PETA, the security of human rights, compliance on the environment, corruption issues, and perhaps transitional justice is something that you might wish to look at. A lot of questions came to you, Peter. I think perhaps you would like to try and see if there's some that you want to address now.
Okay. I think what the very last question identified is probably the single biggest thing that is getting in the way of the spread of the rule of law today, and that is corruption. And corruption is endemic in many countries. And as we saw from the graphs that were put up earlier, which associated rule of law with economic development, reductions in infant mortality, and a whole lot of other things, the rule of law plays a part in that, but it should never be forgotten that what also plays a part in that is economic development. Yeah. Economic development that is brought by business. 70 or 80 years ago, one of the poorest countries in the world, GDP per capita, was Norway. Norway then found oil, and now it is one of the wealthiest countries in the world per GDP per capita. Nigeria has way more oil than Norway ever had. But it is not moving in the direction Norway is moving in, and that is fundamentally because of corruption, which is endemic in Nigeria, as you know. 150,000 barrels of oil a day are stolen from pipelines running through Nigeria by thieves who are not being caught. Nobody in the last decade has been tried and convicted of oil theft in Nigeria despite that huge level of theft. And it is the theft of that oil and the holes that are left in the pipes as a result of it that causes the vast majority of the devastation to the environment in the Niger Delta. The UNEP report was produced, as you say, 2 years ago. And if you look at the UNEP report, the onus was put very much on a combined group, but fundamentally to be headed by the Nigerian government. 95% of all the revenues from oil in Nigeria go to the Nigerian government. And so, therefore, whilst we are looking to support that, and we are looking to support the initiatives that have been commenced, we cannot tackle what is going on in the Nigeria Delta on our own. It has to be government-led, and it has to be done in a way that doesn't involve corruption. And so, going back to one of the more general questions about how do we globalize the rule of law, we really have to have a global focus on corruption. And the way to attack that, in the classic way of most things, is to follow the money. The money is in most of the Western states. It's in the United States, it's in England, it's in Switzerland, it's in the Cayman Islands and various other places. And until Western governments are willing to attack corruption by following the money, then we will not achieve anything in terms of seeking to deal with it on a local level. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. Santiago, you were challenged in a lot of ways, and I think also applauded.
I'm glad to receive so many questions. When we started the Net Party, the very first meeting I had with one of the founders, we decided to call his wife. She was a congresswoman for 8 years in the city of Buenos Aires, and she was an experienced politician. And so we gave her a call and we said, look, we basically have this idea. We want to hack Congress by entering legislators that will always vote according to an online platform and the whole citizenship can take a part on. What do you think about it? And her first reaction was, well, I'm not sure if it's going to work or not, but I'm definitely certain that it's much better than the current system that we have right now. And basically that gave us the push to start exploring this path. And the question about the tyranny of the majorities is obviously a very important issue to address when you are talking about platforms of collective participation of this nature. In Argentina right now, I would say so also in Turkey, Egypt, Russia, but I can certainly say it about Argentina, a tyranny of the majority is already in place. It's not that we're against and aware of that kind of issues. So the way that we want the way we understand that democracy should work in a context such as the internet or the web is basically by fostering collective intelligence. And the power of collective intelligence is really amazing when you understand the nature of the underlying algorithms and the nature of the potential of the technology set in place. We already seen it in many ways. Actually, the internet already had its illustration age when we saw during the last decade what happened between Wikipedia as a paradigm versus the Encyclopedia Britannica. Wikipedia is a platform that basically operates under the very nature of collective intelligence and now is the most trusted source of knowledge in the world. When you look at the results of any search you do on Google, among the top 5, not top 10, even the top 5 results, you will always find an article from Wikipedia. That means that a lot of people are trusting Wikipedia first rather than the Encyclopedia Britannica or any old school notion of structuring knowledge. And that's a very revealing fact about the power of collective intelligence.
I have to interrupt you there just a minute. It is very true that they do. It does not mean, though, and this is a very big problem that Mr. Wales himself is addressing, that the quality of reliability is always the same. And so we do have to also evolve systems. I'm not saying to just put it aside, but evolve systems in our new world, Sante, which would bring in as well the possibility, not necessarily of gatekeepers, but certainly of collective, shall we say, skepticism, healthy skepticism about the way we rely or misrely on some of the new, let's say, methodologies. Anyway.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting fact. The way a lot of people trust Wikipedia is basically because the authority Wikipedia or the symbols that Wikipedia uses, Wikipedia is all the time Wikipedia is saying how stupid it is. If you look at the symbols or the different aspects that Wikipedia has on any given article, it will always point out, if you read clearly, that an article, a quote is missing, or this article had too many editions in the last day, or this article, or this particular chunk of an article has too many contradictory facts. And Wikipedia itself, as a system, is always saying how little knows about the subject, because it's aware that the content is being put by a lot of people out there. And a lot of people out there point out the contradictions, the volume of editions, the lack of fact-checking. And I think by placing out, by pretending not to be saying, by pretending not to know everything, but rather to question everything, is that we trust the authority of a platform such as Wikipedia more than any other sources of knowledge out there. That said, one of the most important questions also were related to access of technology. The internet in 2 decades basically reached 40% of humanity. It's faster than any other media or communication technology in history. It took the printing press 4 centuries to print 1 billion books. It took the internet only 10 years to reach 1 billion human beings. So in that context, I think it's important to, rather than looking at the current picture, start looking at the film. And in that situation, in that context, clearly the adoption of technology, it's not linear, it's exponential. If we look at the rate of Moore's law and the rate of computing power being duplicated every 18 months during the last 40 years, adoption of technology is, costs are being lowered more and more. In countries such as Kenya, 25% of the GDP of Kenya is being transacted through the use of mobile devices. And that disruptive power is clearly a very strong force in itself. Regarding the institutional frameworks for these new kind of technologies, yes. There's still a lot of questions. There's still a lot of things to explore regarding this. There's very interesting phenomena, for example, regarding bitcoins. Bitcoins is a technology that is basically democratizing the access to a monetary tool. 3D printing technologies are democratizing the access to industry, basically enabling us to, in each home, be able to print any kind of plastic device that we want to print out. Looking at the future of these technologies, everything that incorporates information attributes tends to be very accessible in the short term. So I think there's definitely a lot of innovation going on, and I think that the internet has a lot of interesting potential for transparency and empowering
And I would say, Justice Kennedy, in this respect, for those of you who are in the field more of making laws, we never catch up in the legal framework until it arrives in a case in front of a very high-level court of the legal implications of some of our own technologies, including the ability to manufacture in your home a gun, a weapon, or other nasty thing, and as well as to trade coins and hide entirely the corruption. It's one of the problems of Bitcoin. We haven't caught up, and we never will. Technology will always be ahead of our laws. So an interesting idea is, how do we manage to increase correctly, with good judgment though, the way in which our laws respond to new technologies? Your Grace.
I would say law is not its own end. It must serve the good of humanity. Law and the rule of law must enable us to also deal with some of the multinationals that go into those continents and make their wealth a curse. I would say we must not be afraid to say something is wrong, and I'm repeating myself, when winning cases is decoupled from doing justice. I, as a cleric, have heard some of the audience wrestle with definitional issues. What is law? And who is law for? And law is not there to serve itself. But law should indeed serve the people. So I like that question, and I need to return to it, the question of whether there's a primary school for law. I think that's a very profound question, because You are asking us to differentiate between the letter of the law and the spirit of the law. Yes, you can go to universities and learn the letter of the law and how to interpret that letter, how to bend it and push its own elasticity to address particular questions and sometimes to address questions of those that have access and the resources. But the spirit of the law says humanity matters. Human beings are important. Creation matters. The dignity of creation is important and it matters. And in whatever economic development, and in whatever human development, and in whatever letter of the law that we apply, we need to respect the dignity of each person. We need to respect the well-being of all, and we need to respect creation. So that's really my general points and also my summation to what was raised today.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Thabo. Justice Kennedy.
Like many in the audience, I've been thinking just in the last 15 minutes about the new Internet Party and what it tells us about the capacity that we have to reach our fellow human beings. The Internet should not mislead us in thinking about thought. We cannot confuse simply information, receipt of factoids, with quiet reflection, meditation, deliberation. And I think one of the concerns initially that went through some of our minds when we heard about an internet system that tells legislators what to do is that it eliminates from the legislator himself or herself that capacity of judgment, that capacity of fairness that Edmund Burke wrote about. And it seems to me that you can accommodate this in your system. Your system will have in it some evil people with evil motives, because that's the nature of the human being. But your system can address and will address that in its own terms. And in its own terms, I hope that you and your generation and the world community never cease to ask what the definition of the rule of law is and ought to be. Be careful of this term subjective. When I receive from you, by email shortly I hope, your principles that you set forth, am I going to say, oh, they're subjective? I have a definition of the rule of law that we've discussed that the UN has adopted. And part of it is that the law must respect and preserve the dignity, equality, and human rights of all persons. Is that subjective because I put it down? Or is it the process of thought that tries to absorb the lessons of civilization and tries to probe the future that we can't really see, but that we must attempt to order in a way to accommodate the proposition that all humans are equal and are entitled to dignity and are entitled to freedom. And that's the purpose of your meeting here. And I wish not only to thank my participants and our fine moderator, but all of you for your patience, and to thank also Mr. Newcomb, Mr. Hubbard, Mr. Potero, for what you've done here. And it reminds me of the maxim: never underestimate the power of a few thoughtful people to change the world. It's the only thing that ever has.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our session, and I believe that you also will have found this to have been a most stimulating, provocative, interesting, and thoughtful, insightful 90 minutes that we've spent together. I'd like you very much to thank this group and applaud them for all that they have given to us. And finally, thank you very much from all of us for your questions and for your attention.
Ms. Cattaui, we thank you as well for your excellent moderation of this panel. The substance, the pace, the timing, and the insights and the illuminations provided by this panel have provided us the start that we need to make this the most productive conference ever, and a stimulus for many good ideas that we hope will change the world and strengthen the rule of law in a positive way. We now have time for a brief coffee break of about 15 minutes, so if we'll reconvene here at about 11:25. Thank you.